The gunshot cracked through the morning air like thunder as Daphne Zimmerman stood frozen at the altar, her wedding dress billowing in the hot Texas wind. The church door burst open and Sheriff Wilkins marched down the aisle, his badge glinting in the sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows. "Daphne Zimmerman, you're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Harlow," he announced, his voice echoing through the stunned congregation. It was June 1878 in Redemption Creek, a dusty frontier town nestled in the heart of Texas cattle country. What should have been the happiest day of Daphne's life had just shattered into 1,000 pieces. Her fiancé, Edgar Wilson, the banker's son who had courted her for 6 months, backed away from her as if she were diseased. "I knew there was something not right about you," Edgar hissed, his face contorting with disgust. "A woman who comes to town with no family, no past." Daphne's blue eyes widened with shock. "I didn't kill anyone. I've never even heard of Thomas Harlow." The sheriff stepped forward, handcuffs ready. "We got a telegram from Lerdo. Says you poisoned your employer, stole his money, and ran. The description matches you perfectly." "This is madness," Daphne cried, her voice breaking as tears streamed down her face. "I came from St. Louis 6 months ago. I've never been to Lerdo in my life," the congregation murmured, and several people stood up to leave. No one wanted to be associated with a murderess. Edgar's mother fainted dramatically, while his father comforted her with one hand and glared at Daphne with undisguised contempt. Just as Sheriff Wilkins grabbed Daphne's wrist, a deep voice cut through the chaos. "I reckon you'll want to take your hands off the lady, Sheriff." All heads turned. Standing at the church entrance was Virgil Grayson, tall and imposing, his face shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat. The silver spurs on his boots jingled softly as he stepped forward, his long duster coat revealing the gleaming Colt revolver at his hip. Virgil wasn't from Redemption Creek. He'd ridden into town just 3 days prior and taken a room at the local boarding house. Few people had spoken more than 2 words to him, but everyone knew his type: a drifter, a gunslinger, maybe even a bounty hunter. "This doesn't concern you, stranger," Sheriff Wilkins said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I believe it does," Virgil replied, walking slowly down the aisle, "because I know for a fact that Miss Zimmerman couldn't have killed anyone in Lerdo 3 months ago. And how would you know that?" Edgar demanded, finding his courage now that attention had shifted away from him. Virgil's eyes never left the sheriff's. "Because the real killer was caught 2 weeks ago in El Paso. Name's Lydia Morgan. She's been using different names across Texas, including Daphne Wilson." "Your telegram's outdated, Sheriff." A buzz of conversation filled the church. Sheriff Wilkins frowned, uncertain. "I've got the newspaper article right here," Virgil continued, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "And I've got a letter from the El Paso marshal confirming it. You're about to arrest an innocent woman on her wedding day." The sheriff hesitantly released Daphne's wrist and took the newspaper. As he read, his face paled. This does appear to be legitimate," he admitted reluctantly. Edgar stepped forward, trying to save face. "Well, that may be, but you still think what?" Virgil interrupted, his voice dangerously soft. "That you'd abandon your bride at the first sign of trouble, without even hearing her side. A man who do that isn't worth marrying anyway." Daphne stood straighter, wiping away her tears. For the first time, she looked directly at Virgil Grayson, wondering who this stranger was and why he'd come to her defense. "Sheriff," Virgil continued, "you might want to verify this with a telegram to El Paso, but in the meantime, I suggest you apologize to Miss Zimmerman for disrupting her wedding." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "I was just doing my duty based on the information I had." "And now you have new information," Virgil replied coolly. Turning to Daphne, Sheriff Wilkins mumbled an apology before hastily retreating from the church. Edgar approached Daphne tentatively. "Darling, I was just shocked." "Surely you understand." "I understand perfectly." Daphne cut him off, her voice firm despite her trembling hands. She removed her engagement ring and handed it to him. "A husband should stand by his wife through any storm, Edgar. You couldn't even manage it for 5 minutes." A hush fell over the church as Edgar's face reddened with humiliation. He snatched the ring and stormed out, his parents following close behind. One by one, the wedding guests filed out, some offering sympathetic glances to Daphne, others avoiding her eyes altogether. Soon, only Daphne and Virgil remained in the church, along with the bewildered preacher. "How did you know?" Daphne asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "About the real murderer," Virgil's expression softened slightly. "I've been tracking Lydia Morgan for months. She's left a trail of broken lives across 3 states. When I heard the sheriff talking about the telegram yesterday in the saloon, I knew I had to intervene." "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." "I know enough," Virgil replied. "I know you work hard at the dressmaker's shop. I know you bake bread for old Mrs. Henderson because her hands are too arthritic to knead the dough. I know you teach the Miller children to read on Sundays after church." Daphne blushed, surprised that this quiet stranger had observed so much about her in just 3 days. "Thank you," she said simply. "You saved me from jail, or worse." Virgil nodded, the ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "You might want to change out of that dress. I doubt you'll have use for it today." With that, he tipped his hat and walked out, leaving Daphne standing alone at the altar, her life completely transformed in the span of 15 minutes. The following days were brutal for Daphne. Though officially cleared when confirmation came from El Paso, the whispers followed her everywhere. Edgar had spread rumors that she must have done something wrong, otherwise why would the authorities have suspected her in the first place? His wounded pride couldn't accept that he had abandoned her when she needed him most. The dressmaker, Mrs. Fowler, was sympathetic but concerned about losing business. "Perhaps you should take a week off, dear," she suggested gently. "Let things calm down a bit." Daphne knew what that meant. People were avoiding the shop because of her. She nodded, fighting back tears. Without work, her meager savings wouldn't last long, and the wedding preparations had already stretched her finances thin. Walking back to her small rented room above the general store, Daphne kept her head high despite feeling the stares of townspeople. As she passed the saloon, a group of men stepped out, blocking her path. "Well, if it ain't the murdering bride," one slurred, his breath reeking of whiskey. "I was cleared of those charges," Daphne said firmly, trying to step around them. Another man grabbed her arm. "Maybe, maybe not. But we don't need your kind in Redemption Creek. Town was peaceful before you came along." Fear gripped Daphne's heart as the men closed in around her. Just then, the distinctive sound of a revolver being cocked cut through the tension. "I believe the lady would like to pass," Virgil said, his gun steady in his hand. The men immediately backed off, muttering curses but unwilling to challenge the gunslinger. Virgil escorted Daphne to the general store without a word. "That's twice you've come to my rescue, Mr. Grayson," Daphne said when they reached her door. "I'm beginning to wonder if you're following me." A hint of amusement flickered in Virgil's eyes. "Just happened to be in the right place." Daphne hesitated, then asked, "Would you like to come in for coffee? It's the least I can offer as thanks." Virgil seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding. Daphne's room was small but neat, with a few personal touches that made at home: a quilt on the bed, a vase of wildflowers on the table, and a small bookshelf filled with well-worn novels. As she prepared coffee on the small stove, Daphne asked, "Why are you still in town?" "I thought bounty hunters moved on once their quarry was caught." "I'm not exactly a bounty hunter," Virgil replied, removing his hat and placing it on the table. "I used to be a Texas Ranger. Now I track specific criminals when someone hires me to do so." "And who hired you to find this Lydia Morgan?" "Her husband, or rather one of them. She had a habit of marrying men, stealing their money, and disappearing. Sometimes they died under mysterious circumstances." Daphne shuddered as she poured the coffee. "That's terrible, and she was using my name." "One of many she used. She's clever that way, taking common enough names that wouldn't stand out." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, sipping their coffee. Daphne studied Virgil more carefully now. He was older than her 22 years, perhaps 30, with lines around his eyes that spoke of long days in the sun. His dark hair was slightly too long, and a scar ran along his jawline. He wasn't conventionally handsome like Edgar, but there was something compelling about him, a quiet strength, an unwavering steadiness. "What will you do now?" Virgil asked, breaking into her thoughts. Daphne sighed. "I don't know, Mrs. Fowler has asked me to take some time off, which means I'm essentially without work. I can't stay here much longer without income." "You could leave," Virgil suggested. "Start fresh somewhere else." "With what money?" Daphne shook her head. "Besides, running away would only confirm their suspicions. I've done nothing wrong, and I refuse to act as if I have." A ghost of a smile touched Virgil's lips. "You've got spirit, Miss Zimmerman. Please call me Daphne. I think you've earned that right after saving me twice." "Daphne," he said, her name sounding different in his deep voice. "Then you must call me Virgil." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Both were outsiders in their own way, both familiar with hardship. The moment was broken by a commotion outside. They both went to the window to see a crowd gathering in the street. At the center stood Edgar, gesturing wildly. "I think your former fiancé is stirring up trouble," Virgil observed. Daphne grabbed her shawl. "I need to see what's happening." They hurried downstairs and joined the edge of the crowd. Edgar was addressing the townspeople, his face flushed with emotion or possibly alcohol. "We all know the truth," he was saying. "That woman deceived me, deceived all of us. Who knows what else she's hiding? And now she's consorting with a gunslinger." Several people turned to stare at Daphne and Virgil. "Edgar Wilson, you're making a fool of yourself," Daphne called out, stepping forward. "Your pride is hurt because you showed your true colors at the first sign of trouble." Edgar's face darkened. "You tricked me into proposing. You probably knew the law was after you." "The law was never after me," Daphne replied calmly. "It was after someone else entirely, as has been proven." "Convenient that your gunslinger friend showed up with that story, isn't it?" Edgar sneered. "Who's to say it's even true? For all we know, you two have been working together all along," the crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement. Virgil stepped forward, his hand hovering near his gun. "Mr. Wilson, you're spreading lies about a lady's reputation. I suggest you stop." "Or what?" Edgar challenged, emboldened by the crowd. "You'll shoot me. Prove you're nothing but a violent criminal." The tension in the air was palpable. Daphne could see Sheriff Wilkins pushing his way through the crowd, likely alerted by the gathering. "There won't be any shooting today," Sheriff Wilkins announced, positioning himself between the two men. "This town's seen enough drama. Wilson, go home and sleep it off. Grayson, I'd appreciate it if you'd keep your gun holstered." Edgar wasn't done. "Sheriff, are you absolutely certain that woman isn't a criminal? Have you thoroughly investigated her background?" The sheriff sighed. "I received confirmation from El Paso. The real suspect has been apprehended. Miss Zimmerman is innocent of those charges." "Those charges," Edgar emphasized. "But what about other charges? She came here with no references, no family. For all we know, she could be running from something else." A few townspeople nodded, and Daphne felt despair washing over her. She'd worked so hard to build a life here, to be accepted, and now it was all crumbling. Virgil's voice cut through her thoughts. "I can vouch for Miss Zimmerman's character," he said clearly. "I've known her family in St. Louis for years." Daphne stared at him in shock. It was a blatant lie, they'd only just met. "Is that so?" the sheriff asked skeptically. "Yes," Virgil continued smoothly. "Her father, Harold Zimmerman, was a respected carpenter. I did some work for him a few years back. When I heard Daphne had moved to Redemption Creek, I thought I'd pay my respects while passing through." Daphne held her breath. Her father had indeed been a carpenter named Harold, but he died when she was 18, prompting her move west for a fresh start. How could Virgil possibly know that? The sheriff studied Virgil's face, searching for deception. "And you just happen to have information about this Lydia Morgan character too?" "As I told you before, I was tracking her for a client. It was coincidence that brought me here when Miss Zimmerman needed clearing." Some of the tension ebbed from the crowd. A respectable connection to St. Louis made Daphne seem less mysterious, less threatening. Edgar, seeing he was losing ground, made one last attempt. "If you're such old friends, why didn't Daphne mention you before? Why didn't she call on you when she first arrived in town?" All eyes turned to Daphne. She swallowed hard, then lifted her chin. Virgil and I weren't exactly friends in St. Louis, she said carefully. He worked for my father briefly, but our paths rarely crossed. I had no idea he'd become a tracker since then, or that he'd ever pass through Redemption Creek. It was close enough to what Virgil had said that it seemed plausible. The sheriff nodded slowly. "All right, show's over," he announced to the crowd. "Everyone go about your business. Wilson, I mean it, go home." As the crowd dispersed, Edgar shot Daphne a venomous look before stalking off toward the saloon. The sheriff approached Virgil and Daphne. "I don't know if I believe that story about St. Louis," he said quietly, "but I do know that telegram from El Paso was legitimate. Miss Zimmerman, I apologize again for the misunderstanding. Grayson, I'd appreciate it if you'd keep the peace while you're in my town." With that, he tipped his hat and walked away. "How did you know about my father?" Daphne whispered as they walked back toward the general store. "I didn't," Virgil admitted. "It was a guess. Most women who strike out on their own do so after losing family. The fact that you came without references suggested you might have lost your parents. Carpenter seemed like a respectable trade to attribute to a father." "He was a carpenter," Daphne said softly. "He died 4 years ago, influenza." Virgil's eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm sorry for your loss. It seems my guess was more accurate than I realized." "Why did you lie for me?" "Because sometimes the truth doesn't matter as much as what people are willing to believe. This town needs to see you connected to something they understand, something respectable." They reached her door, and Daphne turned to face him. "Thank you again. But I can't keep relying on you to rescue me. I need to figure out how to survive here on my own or decide it's time to move on." Virgil studied her face for a long moment. "What if you had work? Would you stay then?" "Of course, but Mrs. Fowler won't take me back until the gossip dies down, and no one else in town will hire me now." "I might have a solution," Virgil said. "Meet me at the Henderson Ranch tomorrow at noon." Before she could ask more questions, he tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Daphne wondering what the mysterious gunslinger had in mind. The Henderson Ranch lay 3 miles outside of town, a modest spread run by James Henderson and his elderly mother, the same Mrs. Henderson to whom Daphne delivered bread each week. As Daphne approached the main house the next day, she spotted Virgil talking with James near the corral. James Henderson was a quiet, hard-working man in his 40s who had never married. He nodded respectfully to Daphne as she approached. "Miss Zimmerman, good to see you," he said. "Mr. Grayson here tells me you might be looking for work." Daphne glanced at Virgil in surprise. "I am, yes, though I'm not sure what skills I could offer a ranch. My mother's health is failing," James explained. "She needs more care than I can provide while running the ranch. She's always spoken highly of you, says you're kind and patient when you bring her bread. I'd be willing to pay you to look after her, help with cooking and household matters." Daphne's heart leaped. It was perfect away from town and the gossips, doing work she could manage. "I would be honored, Mr. Henderson. When would you like me to start? Today, if possible. You can have the small room off the kitchen. It's not much, but it's private." "I'll need to collect my things from town," Daphne said, already mentally packing her few possessions. "I can drive you in the wagon," James offered. "Grayson tells me some folks in town have been giving you trouble. Might be safer if you're not alone." Daphne nodded gratefully, then turned to Virgil. "How did you arrange this?" "I stopped by to ask about work for myself," Virgil explained. "Henderson mentioned needing someone to help with his mother. It seemed like a good fit for your situation." James excused himself to prepare the wagon, leaving Daphne and Virgil alone. "You're looking for work here too?" Daphne asked, surprised. "I've been on the move for a long time," Virgil said, his eyes on the distant mountains. "Might be nice to stay in one place for a while." Daphne studied his profile, wondering what demons drove this man to wander. "What about your work as a tracker? Won't your clients need you?" "I've fulfilled my obligations." Lydia Morgan was the last name on my list. There was something in his tone that suggested a deeper meaning, but before Daphne could question him further, James returned with the wagon. The trip to town was tense but uneventful. A few people watched from windows as Daphne packed her belongings, but with James and Virgil flanking her, No one dared approach. She paid her rent, said goodbye to her landlord, and within an hour was heading back to the Henderson Ranch to her new home and new beginning. The next few weeks passed in a pleasant rhythm. Daphne cared for Mrs. Henderson, cooked for the ranch hands, and kept the house in order. The old woman was a delight, sharp-witted despite her physical frailty, full of stories about the early days of Redemption Creek. Virgil had indeed found work at the ranch as well, helping with the cattle and repairing fences. He often took his meals with James and the other hands in the bunkhouse, but occasionally joined Daphne and Mrs. Henderson in the main house. During those meals, Daphne learned bits and pieces about Virgil's past. He'd been a Texas Ranger for 8 years before resigning to track down his sister's killer, a man who had escaped justice through legal technicalities. That search had led him to become a tracker of dangerous fugitives, working sometimes within the law, sometimes just outside it. "And did you find him?" Daphne asked one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner. "Your sister's killer." Virgil was silent for a long moment, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Yes," he finally said, 2 years ago in Abilene." "What happened?" "He died." Virgil's tone made it clear he wouldn't elaborate further. "After that, I kept tracking. It was all I knew how to do anymore, but each job left me feeling emptier than the last." Daphne understood then why he seemed ready to stop, to stay in one place. Revenge had driven him for so long that its absence left a void. "What about you?" Virgil asked, changing the subject. "Do you miss town life?" Daphne smiled. "Not at all. I'm happier here than I've been in a long time. Mrs. Henderson treats me like family, and James is a fair employer." "And the wedding?" Virgil asked carefully. "Do you regret that it didn't happen?" "I regret wasting 6 months on a man who didn't truly love me," Daphne replied honestly. "But the marriage itself? No, Edgar wanted a decorative wife who would enhance his social standing. I realize now that I would have been miserable." Their conversations often continued like this, growing deeper and more personal as the weeks passed. Daphne found herself looking forward to these quiet moments, to the way Virgil listened intently to everything she said, as if her thoughts and feelings genuinely mattered to him. Summer turned to early autumn, and life at the Henderson Ranch settled into a comfortable routine. Daphne heard from Mrs. Fowler that Edgar had left town, moving to Dallas to work in his uncle's bank. The gossip about Daphne had largely died down, though she rarely ventured into Redemption Creek except for necessary supplies. Then came the night that changed everything. Daphne was awakened by the smell of smoke. She rushed from her room to find the kitchen engulfed in flames, the fire spreading rapidly through the wooden structure. She ran to Mrs. Henderson's room, helping the elderly woman from her bed. "James," Mrs. Henderson cried, "my son." "I'll find him," Daphne promised, leading her toward the front door. "But first I need to get you outside." Once Mrs. Henderson was safely in the yard, Daphne turned back toward the burning house. The roof was beginning to collapse and flames licked at every window. She was about to run toward James's room when strong arms grabbed her from behind. "You can't go back in there," Virgil said firmly, holding her back. "James is still inside." Daphne struggled against his grip. "No, he isn't. He's in the north pasture checking on a sick calf. I just sent one of the hands to fetch him." Relief washed over Daphne, followed immediately by horror as she watched the house burn. Everything she owned was inside: her clothes, her few keepsakes, the books she treasured. But material possessions could be replaced. Lives couldn't. The ranch hands formed a bucket brigade from the well, but it was clear the house couldn't be saved. They focused instead on preventing the fire from spreading to the barn and bunkhouse. As they watched the roof collapse in a shower of sparks, Virgil kept his arm around Daphne's shoulders. She leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "How did it start?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "Probably the stove," Virgil replied. "The chimney needed cleaning. James had mentioned getting to it this week." By dawn, the house was nothing but smoldering ruins. James had returned and was comforting his mother, who wept for the home she'd lived in for 40 years. Daphne stood apart, feeling suddenly adrift. Without the house, there was no place for her at the ranch, no work to do. Virgil approached, his face streaked with soot. "Are you all right?" Daphne nodded, just wondering what happens next. "I've lost my position along with everything else." "James will rebuild," Virgil said. "It'll take time, but he won't abandon the ranch. And in the meantime, Mrs. Henderson will likely stay with her sister in Dallas." "James will bunk with the hands," Daphne sighed. "I suppose I'll have to find work back in town if anyone will have me." Virgil was quiet for a moment, then said, "There's another option. I've been saving to buy land of my own. There's a small homestead for sale about 10 miles from here. Good water, decent grazing land." Daphne looked at him questioningly, not understanding where this was leading. "A man needs a wife to build a proper home," Virgil continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "Especially out here." Daphne's breath caught in her throat. "Virgil, are you asking?" "I'm not offering a grand romance like in those novels you read," he said softly. "But I can promise to respect you, protect you, and work every day to build a good life for us. And though I didn't plan on it, I've grown to care for you deeply these past months." Daphne's heart raced. This wasn't how she'd imagined a proposal, standing amidst the ruins of a burned house, covered in soot and wearing a borrowed coat. Yet somehow it felt right. Virgil had stood by her when everyone else turned away. He defended her honor with both his gun and his word. Most importantly, he saw her for who she truly was. "I care for you too," she admitted. "More than I realized until this moment." Virgil took her hands in his. "Is that a yes?" Daphne smiled through the tears that suddenly filled her eyes. "Yes, I'll marry you, Virgil Grayson." He leaned forward and kissed her gently, his lips warm against hers. It wasn't the passionate embrace Daphne had read about in novels, but it held a promise that thrilled her more than any fictional romance ever could. The promise of a future built on mutual respect, shared hardship, and growing love. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Daylesford, a neighboring town where Daphne's reputation hadn't been tarnished. Mrs. Henderson insisted on buying Daphne a new dress, though much simpler than the elaborate wedding gown she'd worn for her failed wedding to Edgar. "This one suits you better anyway, dear," the old woman said fondly. "Practical but still pretty, just like you." James Henderson stood as witness for Virgil, while Mrs. Henderson herself stood for Daphne. After the ceremony, they shared a modest meal at Daylesford's hotel before riding to the homestead that was now theirs. The house was small, just 2 rooms with a lean-to kitchen, but solidly built. Virgil had spent the 2 weeks since his proposal repairing the roof, fixing broken windows, and making the place habitable. It was sparse, with only the most basic furniture, but to Daphne it represented everything she'd ever wanted, a home of her own with a man who valued her for herself. That first night, as they sat on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one in the vast Texas sky, Daphne realized how differently things might have turned out. If Virgil hadn't been in the church that day, if he hadn't stood up for her when the entire town turned against her, she might be in jail or worse. "What made you speak up that day?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence. "In the church, when the sheriff tried to arrest me." "You didn't know me then," Virgil considered her question. "I've seen too many innocent people condemned without a fair hearing. Something in your eyes told me you weren't guilty, just scared and alone." He took her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. "I never expected to find someone like you, Daphne, someone who could make me want to stop running, to build something lasting. And I never expected to find someone who would stand by me when it mattered most," she replied softly. "Someone who saw worth in me when others saw only suspicion." Their lips met in a kiss that held more passion than their first, a promise of the love that was growing between them. As the kiss deepened, Daphne knew that while their beginning had been unusual, their story was just getting started. Over the years, the homestead flourished under their care. They added rooms to the house as their family grew, first a son, then twin daughters. Virgil's skill with horses proved valuable, and they built a successful business breeding and training quality mounts for ranchers throughout the region. Occasionally, they would encounter people from Redemption Creek at markets or county fairs. Some would look away in embarrassment, remembering how they'd treated Daphne. Others would greet them cordially, especially after the real Lydia Morgan's crimes became well known throughout Texas. Edgar Wilson never returned to Redemption Creek, but they heard he'd married a banker's daughter in Dallas and seemed content with his choice. Daphne could only feel grateful that his rejection had ultimately led her to true happiness. On their 10th anniversary, as they sat on the expanded porch of their thriving ranch, watching their children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Virgil gave Daphne a small wooden box. Inside was a delicate silver locket. When she opened it, she found a tiny scrap of newspaper, the very article about Lydia Morgan's capture that Virgil had used to clear her name. "To remind us how our story began," Virgil said, helping her fasten it around her neck. Daphne touched the locket, then leaned against her husband's strong shoulder. "I think I prefer to remember how it continued," she said, "and how it grows more beautiful with each passing day." Virgil's arm tightened around her as they watched the first stars appear. Their beginning might have been born of false accusations and near tragedy, but their life together was built on the surest foundation of all truth, trust, and a love that had only deepened with time.